You can pay off your entire mortgage tomorrow and technically become almost no richer. Suppose you have a $900,000 net worth, including $200,000 in cash and investments, and you still owe $180,000 on your house. You take $180,000 from your assets and eliminate the mortgage. One asset falls by $180,000. One liability falls by the same amount. Your net worth is still roughly $900,000. And yet your financial life can change immediately. My name is Mike, and this is the part of paying off a house that I think gets missed when the conversation becomes nothing more than mortgage rate versus stock market return. Eliminating the mortgage doesn't just change what you owe. It changes how much income your life requires every single month. That affects how long your savings can support you, how damaging a job loss would be, how much investment income you eventually need, and even what salary you can afford to say no to. So the interesting question isn't whether a paid-off house makes you richer overnight. On paper, it may not. The interesting question is how two households with the exact same net worth can have completely different levels of financial security simply because one of them needs thousands of dollars less every month to keep life running. And once we run that math, paying off a mortgage starts looking like something much bigger than eliminating a debt. Let's build the example carefully, because this is where the difference between net worth and financial strength becomes obvious. Suppose a household owns a $600,000 home with $180,000 left on the mortgage. They also have $480,000 across cash, retirement accounts, and other investments. Their assets total $1,080,000 minus the mortgage, giving them a net worth of $900,000. Now suppose they use $180,000 of accessible assets to eliminate the mortgage. Their financial assets fall from $480,000 to $300,000, but their debt falls from $180,000 to zero. They still own the same $600,000 house. Their net worth is still $900,000. Nothing magical happened to the headline number. But their monthly equation changed immediately. Assume their mortgage principal and interest had been $2,000 per month. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, maintenance, and utilities do not disappear when the loan disappears, so we're not pretending the house suddenly becomes free. What disappears is that $2,000 debt payment, which means $24,000 per year, no longer has to be produced just to service the mortgage. Before payoff, suppose the household needed $6,000 per month for essential and difficult-to-cut expenses, including that mortgage payment. That's $72,000 per year. After payoff, required spending falls to $4,000 per month or $48,000 per year. Their lifestyle did not suddenly become cheaper because they stopped eating or driving. One major fixed obligation simply disappeared. That gives us the first major effect. Their break-even income falls. Before the payoff, a household bringing home $5,000 per month against $6,000 of required spending has a $1,000 monthly deficit. After the mortgage disappears, that same $5,000 of take-home income against $4,000 of required spending produces a $1,000 surplus. Same income, same house, same approximate net worth, completely different cash flow position. Now think about what that does during a job loss. Suppose one spouse loses a job and household take-home income temporarily falls from $8,000 per month to $5,000. Before payoff, required expenses of $6,000 mean savings have to cover the missing $1,000 every month. After payoff, the household can potentially cover its $4,000 required spending on the remaining income and still have room left over. That is why fixed expenses matter so much. Variable spending can often be reduced when something goes wrong. You can postpone travel, eat out less, delay an upgrade, or cancel a subscription. A mortgage payment is different. The lender doesn't care that this is a bad quarter for your household. The payment has a date and an amount, and your budget has to make room for it. The second effect is what happens to financial runway. Before payoff, imagine this household had $120,000 that could reasonably be accessed if income disappeared. With $72,000 of required annual spending, that represents about 20 months of expenses. Divide $120,000 by $6,000 per month, and you get 20 months. Now suppose the mortgage were already gone, and required spending were $48,000 per year. That same $120,000 would cover 30 months at $4,000 per month. The savings account didn't grow. The investments didn't earn anything. Yet the amount of time those assets could buy increased by 50% because the household made survival cheaper. This is a useful way to think about financial strength. We normally focus on increasing the numerator, more savings, more investments, more income. But there is another lever. You can reduce the denominator. If the amount your household must spend every month falls, every dollar you already own becomes capable of supporting you for longer. Of course, our original household used $180,000 to eliminate the mortgage, so we also have to account for the liquidity they gave up. This is where the payoff decision becomes more complicated than simply saying debt is bad. If paying off the house leaves you with almost no accessible money, you may reduce monthly obligations while creating a different vulnerability. Suppose someone has $200,000 in liquid investments and owes $180,000 on the mortgage. Using nearly everything to become mortgage-free would leave only $20,000 accessible. Even with lower monthly expenses, that could be an uncomfortable position if the roof fails, income disappears, or another major expense arrives. So paying off the mortgage does two things at once. It reduces future required cash flow, but it can also reduce present liquidity. A strong payoff plan has to consider both. Owning a house outright while having almost no accessible reserves is not the same thing as owning a house outright with a healthy financial buffer. Now we get to the third effect, and this is where the numbers become surprisingly large. Reducing required spending can dramatically reduce the amount of wealth needed to make work optional. Let's use a hypothetical withdrawal framework purely as an illustration. Suppose someone wants a portfolio capable of supporting $72,000 of annual spending, and they use a Bonfincham starting withdrawal assumption for planning. 72,000 divided by Bonfincham gives a portfolio target of about $1.8 million. Again, Bonfincham is not a guarantee. Sustainable withdrawals depend on investment returns, inflation, taxes, portfolio allocation, time horizon, spending flexibility, and the sequence of market returns. We're using the assumption to show how sensitive an independence target is to annual spending. Now remove $24,000 of annual mortgage payments. Required spending falls from $72,000 to $48,000. At the same hypothetical Bonfincham starting rate, $48,000 of annual spending corresponds to about $1.2 million. The difference is $600,000. Notice what happened. Paying off $180,000 of mortgage debt did not magically create $600,000 of net worth. That would be nonsense. What it did was remove $24,000 of recurring annual spending, and under our hypothetical framework, supporting $24,000 of annual spending indefinitely requires a much larger pool of capital than $24,000. That's why eliminating a recurring expense can be more powerful than the monthly number initially suggests. You aren't merely saving $2,000 this month. You are reducing the amount of income or investment capital your future life needs to generate every month after that. Now we need to deal with the obvious counter-argument. What if the mortgage rate is low and investing the money has a higher expected return? Suppose you owe $180,000 at 3%. Paying it off gives you something economically similar to avoiding 3% mortgage interest, adjusted for taxes and the specifics of your situation. If you instead invest that money in a diversified stock portfolio for decades, your expected return may be higher than 3%, but that return is uncertain and will arrive with volatility. At a 7% mortgage rate, the comparison looks different. Avoiding 7% interest is economically much more valuable than avoiding 3%, and the interest savings are contractually knowable in a way future stock returns are not. That doesn't automatically mean everyone with a 7% mortgage should liquidate investments tomorrow, because taxes, liquidity, diversification, emergency reserves, and other goals still matter. But the hurdle for choosing investments over payoff becomes much higher. This is why I don't like universal rules such as always pay off the house or never pay off cheap debt. Those statements collapse several separate variables into one interest rate. You need to compare the mortgage costs, the expected but uncertain return available elsewhere, the value of liquidity, your time horizon, and the impact that payment has on your required monthly cash flow. There's also a difference between paying a mortgage off early and simply reaching the end of the loan naturally. If you're deciding whether to send an extra $50,000 to a low-rate mortgage today, opportunity cost matters enormously. If the final payment is happening because you've reached the end of the amortization schedule, there is no new $50,000 allocation decision. The cash flow benefit simply arrives because the obligation ends. And once it arrives, what you do with the former payment matters. If $2,000 per month disappears from the mortgage and quietly becomes $2,000 of additional lifestyle spending, your financial flexibility may not improve nearly as much as expected. You removed one fixed obligation and gradually replaced it with new consumption. If instead you redirect some or all of that $2,000 toward investing, the household gets two benefits at the same time. The expense floor stays lower, while investable assets begin growing faster. That combination, lower required spending and higher asset accumulation, is where a paid-off house can materially accelerate financial independence. Take a hypothetical $2,000 invested monthly for 15 years at an average annual return of 7%. If returns happen to match that assumption, the account would grow to roughly $630,000. You would have contributed $360,000 yourself, with the rest coming from investment growth. Actual market returns will vary, sometimes substantially, but the example shows what redirecting a former payment can potentially do over a long period. So the payoff changes three variables at once. Your minimum required income can fall. The assets you retain can represent more months or years of spending. And the amount of portfolio wealth required to support your lifestyle can fall because the lifestyle itself has become less expensive to maintain. That is why the day before and the day after your final mortgage payment can look almost identical on a net worth statement while feeling completely different financially. Net worth measures assets minus liabilities. It does not measure how much cash your life demands from you every 30 days. And that leads to the more interesting question. If the mathematical advantage is really about reducing required cash flow, why does eliminating the mortgage often change the way people make decisions about work, risk, spending, and retirement? Because wealth isn't only psychological when the number gets bigger. Sometimes the biggest psychological change happens when the number you need gets smaller. That smaller number changes more than the budget because most households build their lives around income continuing on schedule. Your salary arrives, the mortgage leaves, insurance leaves, utilities leave, and everything else gets arranged around those fixed commitments. As long as income remains stable, the system feels normal. You may not even notice how much of next month's paycheck has already been promised before you earn it. The psychological pressure appears when income becomes uncertain. Maybe your company announces layoffs. Maybe you're considering a career change. Maybe one spouse wants to stop working temporarily. The question is no longer simply whether the new option is attractive. Your brain immediately begins calculating whether the household can continue carrying every obligation already attached to the current income. This is why fixed costs behave differently from ordinary lifestyle spending. If you spend $400 a month eating out, you can reduce that quickly when circumstances change. If you have a $2,000 mortgage payment, reducing it next month usually isn't an option. You committed future income years before you knew what your future circumstances would look like. That commitment can create what I think of as an income floor. Suppose your household needs $6,000 every month just to keep the basic system functioning. A job paying enough to support that number may feel necessary even if you dislike the work. A career change that temporarily reduces household income to $5,000 per month doesn't just represent a smaller paycheck, it creates a structural deficit. Remove a $2,000 mortgage payment, and suddenly that same $5,000 income can support a $4,000 expense floor. The career opportunity didn't become safer. Your household became more capable of absorbing the risk. That distinction matters because people often assume financial confidence comes from earning more, when sometimes it comes from needing less. This connects directly to loss aversion. When your lifestyle requires nearly all of your current income, the possibility of earning less can feel disproportionately threatening. You're not only evaluating what you might gain from changing jobs or starting something new, you're imagining the consequences of losing the income that currently keeps a large system running. So you stay. You accept conditions you might otherwise reject. You delay the career experiment another year because the downside feels immediate while the upside feels uncertain. None of those decisions has to be irrational. If your fixed obligations are large enough, protecting income may genuinely be the responsible choice. But lower the expense floor and the same person can evaluate risk differently. Losing $20,000 of annual income is very different when the household requires $48,000 to operate instead of $72,000. The amount of the pay cut didn't change, the consequences did. This is where people sometimes misunderstand the psychological value of becoming mortgage-free. They describe it as simply feeling good about having no mortgage, as though the benefit were emotional but financially irrelevant. In reality, at least part of that feeling can come from a very concrete change in the household's margin for error. If your required monthly spending falls, more outcomes become survivable. A layoff can last longer before becoming a crisis. A business can take longer to become profitable. A bad investment year doesn't necessarily collide with the same level of mandatory spending. Even retirement becomes less dependent on producing a large amount of cash flow every single year. But there is a behavioral trap waiting on the other side. Human beings adapt quickly to available income. If the mortgage disappears and $2,000 suddenly remains in checking every month, that money can begin looking less like newly created flexibility and more like newly available spending capacity. Maybe the first upgrade is harmless, then the car gets nicer, vacations become more expensive, restaurants become more frequent, a few subscriptions appear. Eventually, the household has replaced a $2,000 mortgage payment with $1,500 of recurring lifestyle commitments and wonders why being mortgage-free didn't feel as transformative as expected. That is lifestyle inflation working in reverse against the payoff. The financial power came from reducing the amount of income the household required. If spending expands until it consumes the freed cash flow, you preserve the paid-off house but surrender much of the optionality it created. This is why I would separate standard of living from cost of survival. There is nothing wrong with enjoying more of your money after paying off the house. The danger is turning optional spending into another collection of permanent obligations. Freedom comes from the gap between what you earn and what you must spend, not from keeping every dollar permanently optimized. There is another psychological complication with paying off a mortgage early. Certainty feels unusually valuable. If you send an extra dollar toward principal, the interest avoided is relatively predictable. If you invest that dollar instead, the future outcome is uncertain. That can make mortgage payoff emotionally attractive even when the expected return calculation favors investing. For some people, that certainty helps them stay disciplined. For others, it can become an excuse to avoid all investment risk. Someone with an extremely low mortgage rate might aggressively eliminate the loan while neglecting retirement investing simply because watching debt fall feels more satisfying than watching a portfolio fluctuate. That is why the correct decision cannot come entirely from emotion either. Psychological comfort has value, but it still has an opportunity cost. If paying off cheap debt years early requires abandoning long-term investment opportunities, you should understand the trade rather than pretending one side has no downside. The opposite personality can make the opposite mistake. Someone sees a low mortgage rate and concludes that debt should be carried forever because the spreadsheet expects investments to earn more. Mathematically, that can be reasonable under certain assumptions. Behaviorally, it only works if the difference is actually invested, and if the household can tolerate the debt through bad markets, income disruptions, and changing life circumstances. The spreadsheet assumes consistency. Humans have circumstances. That's why the most important psychological shift after mortgage payoff may not be relief. It may be optionality. You have reduced the number of future decisions that require a particular level of income to work. The job can change, the market can fall, retirement can arrive. Your household still has expenses, but fewer dollars are already spoken for before the month begins. And that gives us a better way to think about wealth itself. Wealth is not only the value of everything you own minus everything you owe. Two households can have identical net worth and completely different levels of financial pressure because one needs twice as much monthly cash flow to keep functioning. The stronger household is not automatically the one with the bigger house, the larger salary, or even the larger investment account. Sometimes it's the household whose future income has fewer claims against it. So if paying off the mortgage creates this new margin, the final challenge is making sure you actually keep it. Because the day the payment disappears, you have a decision to make about every dollar that used to belong to the lender. And what you do with that money determines whether becoming mortgage-free simply feels different or permanently changes the structure of your financial life. So when the mortgage disappears, don't start with the question, what should I do with the extra money? Start one step earlier. Recalculate what your life now costs. If required household spending fell from $6,000 a month to $4,000, that $2,000 reduction is not automatically spending money. It is newly created financial margin, and you get to decide how much of that margin you want to keep. The first thing I would protect is liquidity. A paid-off house is valuable, but you cannot easily use a bedroom to pay for groceries. Property taxes still arrive, insurance still arrives. Roofs, plumbing, appliances, and HVAC systems continue aging after the lender disappears. So before aggressively redirecting every former mortgage dollar somewhere else, make sure the household still has an appropriate accessible reserve for both normal emergencies and home expenses. This is especially important if you're considering paying the mortgage off early with a large lump sum. Run the calculation after the payoff, not just before it. If eliminating a $180,000 mortgage leaves you with $10,000 accessible and nearly everything else trapped in the house or retirement accounts, you may have reduced one risk while creating another. Then decide how much of the former payment should remain permanently uncommitted. This is the part people often skip. If $2,000 per month just became available, you don't necessarily need to immediately assign all $2,000 to another recurring obligation. Keeping part of that cash flow flexible is one of the benefits you work to create. Maybe you invest $1,500 and leave $500 of monthly breathing room. Maybe your numbers suggest a different split. The exact allocation matters less than preserving the principal. Don't automatically replace the mortgage with a new collection of payments that rebuilds the same financial pressure under different names. For the portion you invest, use the priorities that fit your financial plan, taxes, account eligibility, time horizon, and risk tolerance. Employer retirement benefits, tax-advantaged accounts, and diversified long-term investments may all deserve consideration. The important behavioral move is to automate the decision before the freed cash flow quietly becomes normal spending. If your old mortgage payment left checking automatically every month, you already proved you can live without that money. Redirecting some of it automatically can preserve that habit while changing the destination. Instead of financing yesterday's house purchase, those dollars begin financing future flexibility. Now, if you haven't paid the house off yet, don't hear this video as an argument to drain your portfolio tomorrow. The decision to make the final mortgage payment and the experience of already being mortgage-free are two different questions. Before making an aggressive early payoff, compare four things. The effective cost of your mortgage, the liquidity you would surrender, the expected but uncertain return available from investing, and how much eliminating the payment would change your household's required cash flow. A low-rate mortgage attached to a strong balance sheet creates a very different decision from a high-rate mortgage consuming a large share of monthly income. And be careful about using expected investment returns as though they were guaranteed. A portfolio may have a higher expected long-term return than your mortgage rate and still experience years of poor performance. On the other hand, don't treat mortgage payoff as financially free either. Capital placed into home equity is capital you chose not to keep liquid or invest somewhere else. The right question is not which option wins every time. There isn't one. The better question is, which balance sheet structure makes my financial plan strongest under outcomes I can realistically face? For someone early in their career with decades to invest, substantial liquidity, and unusually cheap fixed-rate debt, keeping the mortgage while investing may be perfectly rational. For someone approaching retirement, eliminating a large required payment may dramatically reduce the income their portfolio needs to produce. Same debt, different context. This becomes especially useful when planning retirement. Instead of only asking how large your portfolio needs to become, calculate the spending level that portfolio will need to support. If paying off the mortgage before retirement removes $24,000 of annual required spending, your retirement equation changes even if your net worth barely changes on payoff day. The same logic applies to career decisions. Calculate your household's minimum sustainable income before and after the mortgage. If the number falls dramatically, you may discover that opportunities you once considered financially impossible are now realistic. A lower-paying job, reduced hours, a sabbatical, or starting a business still carries risk, but the consequences of that risk may be smaller than they were before. That's the framework I would keep. Track net worth, but also track your required monthly burn rate. Then ask how many months your accessible resources could support that burn rate and how much income your household actually needs before the budget becomes negative. Those numbers reveal something net worth alone cannot. Suppose two households are both worth $900,000. One requires $72,000 every year just to maintain its basic commitments. The other requires $48,000. On a spreadsheet labeled net worth, they look identical. In a recession, during a layoff, approaching retirement, or considering a career change, they may experience completely different financial realities. That's why everything can change after paying off the house without your net worth changing at all. You didn't suddenly create wealth by moving money from one side of the balance sheet to the other. You changed the amount of cash flow required to keep your financial life functioning. Your savings can potentially last longer. Your break-even income can fall. Your long-term independence target can shrink, and more of tomorrow's paycheck arrives without already belonging to yesterday's decisions. That last part is the one I would remember. Wealth is not only how much you own. It is also how little of your future income has already been promised. So whether you decide to pay your mortgage early, invest instead, or simply let the loan finish on schedule, understand what the finish line actually changes. The goal isn't just to own a house without a loan attached to it. The goal is to use the lower cost of your life to create more choices about what happens next. If you want more Money Mike videos that look beyond the headline number and explain what actually changes your financial freedom, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.